The morning started like any other Tuesday in Washington, D.C., coffee brewing in the Pentagon cafeteria, security guards checking badges, and Admiral Sarah Collins reviewing intelligence reports in her office. She had no idea that in exactly 14 minutes, everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe would be shattered forever. The first sign something was wrong came from the deep space monitoring station in Colorado. A technician named Danny Rodriguez was halfway through his second cup of coffee when his screen exploded with readings that made no sense. Energy signatures beyond anything in Earth's database. Objects moving at impossible speeds. Then, suddenly, nothing but silence from the outer solar system sensors. Back in the Pentagon, Admiral Collins was discussing budget allocations with her staff when the emergency klaxons began their bone-chilling wail, the sound that every military officer dreads, the sound that means the unthinkable is happening. She dropped her coffee mug, watching it shatter on the floor as she sprinted toward the Situation Room, her heart pounding with each step. The massive blast doors slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Dozens of technicians hunched over glowing screens, their faces pale with disbelief. The room's centerpiece, a holographic display the size of a small theater, showed something that shouldn't exist. 12 massive objects, each one dwarfing the largest aircraft carrier, hanging in space like metallic vultures circling their prey. "How long have they been there?" Collins demanded, her voice cutting through the cacophony of urgent voices and beeping alarms. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, barely 25 and fresh from the Space Force Academy, turned to face her. His usually steady hands were shaking as he worked the controls. 17 minutes, Admiral. It just appeared. No warning, no detection by our deep space arrays, nothing. 1 second space was empty. The next second, these things were just there. Collins felt her blood turn to ice. The United States military had spent billions on early warning systems, satellite networks, and detection grids that could spot a baseball-sized object from Mars. How could 12 city-sized ships simply materialize without triggering a single alarm? "Are we sure they're not ours?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. No nation on Earth possessed technology even remotely close to this scale. "Ma'am, our largest space vessel is the ISS-2, and it's about the size of a football field. These things are—" Morrison paused, running calculations on his tablet. "Each one is roughly the size of Manhattan. And they're not just sitting there, they're actively scanning our planet." The room fell silent, except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of fighter jets scrambling from Andrews Air Force Base. Every person in that room understood. They were witnessing history, possibly the last chapter of human independence. Then the air in the center of the room began to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The holographic projectors weren't causing this. Something else was manipulating the very fabric of space around them. Officers instinctively stepped back as the distortion grew larger and more defined. What emerged from that rippling air was the stuff of nightmares and science fiction movies. The figure stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a perfect fusion of organic curves and metallic surfaces that gleamed like polished chrome. For arms extended from its torso, each ending in hands that possessed too many fingers. But it was the eyes that truly unsettled everyone present, glowing orbs that seemed to peer directly into their souls. When it spoke, its voice resonated. With the cold authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "I am Commander Vex of the Galactic Dominion. Your species has been evaluated and found. It's adequate for incorporation into our empire." The pause before adequate felt deliberate, almost insulting. Like a teacher giving a failing student a participation trophy, Collins found her voice first. "Who are you to evaluate us?" Vex's glowing eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a laser. "We are your superiors in every measurable way. Technology, military might, intelligence, longevity. We have conquered 743 worlds. Yours will be 744. Conquered." The word came from President D. Michael Harrison, who had been rushed to the bunker the moment the ships appeared. Even in his hastily thrown-in clothes, he carried himself with the dignity of his office. "We're not some primitive civilization you can just claim. That metallic face contorted into what might have been a smile, though it looked more like a predator baring its teeth. Primitive? You still fight among yourselves over resources that could be synthesized? You pollute the only habitable planet. In your system, you've barely begun to explore your own solar system. By galactic standards, you are indeed primitive. The truth of those words stung because they contained uncomfortable facts. Humanity had reached for the stars, but barely made it past their own backyard. The Mars colonies housed fewer than 10,000 people. The asteroid mining operations were small-scale experiments. Earth's nations still squabbled over oil while fusion technology remained just out of reach. Here are your terms, Vex continued, his forearms moving in complex gestures that somehow emphasized each point. You will surrender 50% of your planet's resources to the Dominion. You will provide 1 million of your strongest individuals for our labor forces. You will submit to permanent orbital monitoring and accept Dominion governors in your major population centers. The room erupted in angry voices. Generals shouted about sovereignty, admirals demanded explanations, and politicians argued about impossible choices. But Vex simply stood there, unmoved by their outrage. Like a mountain weathering a storm, President Harrison raised his hand for silence. And if we refuse, the question hung in the air like a death sentence waiting to be read. Vex's expression didn't change, but something in his glowing eyes suggested he'd been hoping for this question. Refusal equals extinction. We have eliminated 17 species who chose defiance over compliance. Their worlds now serve as examples to others who might consider resistance. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. You have exactly 24 hours to comply. Choose wisely, humans. Before anyone could respond, the hologram began to fade. But just before it vanished completely, Vex added one final comment that chilled everyone to their core. Oh, and don't bother trying to contact your space stations or Mars colonies. They're already under our control. The silence that followed was deafening. The smell of ozone lingered in the air, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. 24 hours to decide between slavery and extinction. 24 hours to make the most important choice in human history. But what none of them knew yet was that this moment of apparent defeat would become the catalyst for humanity's greatest triumph. Because sometimes when you're faced with an impossible choice, the only option is to change the rules of the game entirely. And speaking of changing rules and impossible transformations, if you want to see how small, consistent actions can create massive changes over time, check out my next video about the incredible power of compounding. Click the link in the description or wait for the end screen. You'll be amazed at how this principle can transform your entire life. The moment Commander Vex's hologram disappeared, the crisis room exploded like a pressure cooker that had been building steam for hours. 23 of America's most powerful leaders suddenly found themselves facing a choice that no human being in history had ever confronted. And naturally, they all had different ideas about how to handle it. Secretary of Defense Robert Kane was the first to break the stunned silence. His fist crashed down on the mahogany conference table with such force that coffee cups jumped and classified documents scattered. We can't just roll over. This is humanity we're talking about. His face was red with fury, veins bulging in his neck like a man who'd spent 40 years in the military and wasn't about to start backing down from bullies. Now, but Dr. Lisa Parker, the president's science advisor, wasn't having any of that bravado. She'd spent her career studying the impossible, and she knew exactly how outmatched they were. With what army, Bob? She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Our most advanced weapons are like spears against their technology. They crossed interstellar space in ships that dwarf our cities. Kane's jaw tightened. So what? We just hand over half our planet and 1 million Americans? Is that your scientific recommendation, Doctor? My recommendation is that we face reality. Parker shot back. Those ships could turn Manhattan into a crater before our missiles even left their silos. General Mark Thompson, his weathered face bearing the scars of 3 decades in combat zones, leaned forward with the quiet authority of someone who'd stared death in the face more times than he could count. We faced impossible odds before. Pearl Harbor, 9/11s, the solar flare crisis of 2089. Americans don't surrender. The mention of the solar flare crisis sent a ripple of recognition through the room. Everyone remembered 2089 when coronal mass ejections knocked out half the world's power grids and nearly brought civilization to its knees. America had pulled through that nightmare through sheer determination and ingenuity. President Dezut's voice cut through the rising arguments like a blade through silk. "This isn't about being American," he said quietly, but with enough authority to silence the room. "This is about the survival of our entire species." Those words hung in the air like a death sentence, because he was right. This wasn't about national pride or military honor. This was about whether human beings would continue to exist as free individuals or become cattle for an alien empire. CIA Director Amanda Reed, who'd been silent until now, spread a series of classified satellite photos across the table. The images showed the alien ships in horrifying detail, massive structures bristling with weapons that looked like they could punch holes through moons. "Our satellite analysis shows their ships contain enough firepower to crack continents. They're not bluffing about extinction." The photos were damning evidence. Each ship was a floating fortress, equipped with energy weapons that made nuclear bombs look like firecrackers. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Humanity's entire nuclear arsenal wouldn't even dent one of those vessels. But then Dr. James Mitchell, a young physicist from MIT who'd been invited because of his work on exotic energy signatures, suddenly looked up from his tablet. "But look at this," he interrupted, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery. The tablet showed swirling patterns of energy readings that meant nothing to the politicians, but everything to him. "Their ships are holding position. They wanted to destroy us. Why haven't they already? Why give us time to think?" It was a good question, a damn good question. Why would an all-powerful alien empire give their victims 24 hours to consider surrender? Why not just demonstrate their power with a small display of force? Colonel David Price, fresh from the Space Force and still carrying the intensity of someone who'd spent his career preparing for exactly this kind of scenario, nodded grimly, "Because they need us alive. Dead slaves don't mine asteroids or build. They're monuments." The word slaves hit the room like a physical blow. That's what they were really talking about, not conquest, not occupation, but slavery on a planetary scale. The systematic reduction of human beings to livestock. "Think about it," Price continued, his military training showing as he analyzed the enemy's strategy. "They could have wiped us out from a distance, but instead they're demanding tribute. They want our resources, our labor, our compliance. Can't get any of that from corpses." The debate raged on for hours, voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. Fear gripped the room like a physical presence, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Some advocated immediate surrender. Better to live as slaves than die as heroes. Others proposed desperate last stands, talking about nuclear strikes and kamikaze attacks that everyone knew would be useless. Treasury Secretary Aklina suggested something that made everyone uncomfortable. "What if we negotiate? Offer them 25% instead of 50? Maybe 500,000 people instead of 1,000,000? The silence that followed was deafening. Because that's what fear does. It makes you consider options you never thought you'd consider. General Thompson's voice was ice cold when he responded. "You want to haggle over how many Americans we sell into slavery?" "I want to keep our species alive," Chen shot back. "This isn't about pride, it's about mathematics. If we can reduce their demands, maybe we can rebuild. Maybe we can resist later." Later. Kane's voice was incredulous. "You think they're going to give us a chance to rebuild? They've done this to 700 other worlds, Michael. This is their business model?" The arguments continued, each voice representing a different vision of humanity's future. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to flee. A few suggested trying to contact other alien civilizations, as if the galaxy was full of benevolent species just waiting to help. But it was CIA Director Reed who brought up the most chilling possibility. "What if we're not their first choice? For this planet?" she asked quietly. "What if they're planning to wipe us out anyway once they've stripped Earth of everything valuable?" The room fell silent. Because that scenario made terrible sense. Why keep humans around once you'd extracted all the resources? Why maintain expensive slave populations when you could just move on to the next world? As dawn approached, painting the crisis room's reinforced windows with pale light, President Harrison made the call that would define humanity's future. He stood up slowly, his shoulders bearing the weight of 7 billion lives, and spoke the words that would echo through history. We put it to a vote. Every American citizen, every human being on Earth and in the colonies, democracy will decide our fate. The idea was radical, unprecedented, and probably impossible to implement in 24 hours. But it was also unmistakably human. Their darkest hour, when faced with extinction or slavery, humanity would choose to choose, and that decision would reveal something about the human spirit that Commander Vex and his galactic dominion had never encountered before, a species that refused to let anyone else decide their destiny. But how do you organize a planetary referendum in less than a day? How do you reach every human settlement from the Arctic research stations to the Mars colonies? And most importantly, what happens when an entire species looks into the abyss and has to decide whether to jump or fight? The answer would reshape the galaxy forever. And if you want to understand how individual decisions can create massive, unstoppable momentum, just like what happened next in humanity's story, check out my video about the power of compounding. Because sometimes it's the smallest choices create the biggest changes. What happened next was the most ambitious democratic exercise in human history. 18 hours to reach every human being on Earth and beyond. 18 hours to ask 7 billion people the most important question ever posed. Do we bow down or stand up? The logistics were staggering. Emergency broadcast systems activated across every continent. Voting stations appeared in shopping malls, schools, and community centers. Mobile units rushed to remote villages in the Amazon, research stations in Antarctica, and oil rigs in the North Sea. The International Space Station became a voting booth floating 300 miles above Earth. But the real challenge was reaching the colonies. Mars had 80,000 residents scattered across 12 settlements. The asteroid belt mining stations housed another 30,000. The lunar research facilities had 5,000 more. Quantum communication arrays, normally used for scientific data, suddenly became the lifelines connecting humanity's scattered children in the Pentagon. A room full of the world's best logisticians worked frantically to make the impossible possible. "We need translators for 47 languages," shouted Major Patricia Wells, coordinating the global effort. "We need ballots in Braille, sign language interpreters, and mobile units for every nursing home and hospital." The question itself was elegantly simple. Should humanity submit to the Galactic Dominion's demands or resist? Submit or resist. It's words that would determine the fate of an entire species. As voting began, the world held its breath. In living rooms across America, families gathered around their screens, watching the tally numbers flicker and change like some cosmic scoreboard. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. This wasn't just about politics or policy. This was about whether their children would grow up free or in chains. In New York City, construction worker Tony Ritchie sat on his worn couch, holding his 5-year-old daughter Sophia close as the numbers scrolled across their television. His calloused hands, stained with decades of honest work, trembled slightly. As he watched his neighborhood's votes come in, "What are we watching, Daddy?" Sophia asked, her innocent eyes reflecting the screen's glow. "We're watching people make the most important choice in history, sweetheart," Tony whispered, kissing the top of her head. He'd spent his life building things, skyscrapers, bridges, homes where families could feel safe. The idea of aliens forcing him to build monuments to their conquest made his stomach turn. Meanwhile, in rural Texas, rancher Beth Williams stood on her porch with 20 neighbors, all of them watching the voting results on a tablet propped against a fence post. The evening sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. These were people who'd spent their lives working the land, raising cattle, living by the simple principle that you earned what you got through sweat and determination. Hell, I've been fighting drought, disease, and government regulations for 30 years, Beth said, her voice carrying the stubborn pride of someone who'd never backed down from a challenge, not about to start taking orders from some space tyrant now. But not everyone felt the same way. In major cities, fear was winning over defiance. Parents clutched their children, thinking about the alien ships hovering overhead like metallic vultures. In Los Angeles, Dr. Michael Stevens, a pediatric surgeon, cast his vote for submission while staring at a photo of his twin boys. "I can't risk their lives for pride," he muttered, his hands shaking as he pressed the button. The debate raged in homes, offices, and online forums. Social media exploded with arguments, memes, and desperate pleas. Hashtag Humanity First trended alongside hashtag Survival First. Philosophers debated whether freedom was worth extinction. Military veterans spoke of honor and sacrifice. Parents spoke of protecting their children's future. As the hours ticked by, the results remained devastatingly close. The numbers swung back and forth like a pendulum, each update sending waves of hope or despair through the global audience. At one point, submission led by 2 million votes. An hour later, resistance had pulled ahead by 3 million in the asteroid belt. Miners who'd spent years in the cold void of space voted overwhelmingly for resistance. "We didn't come out here to play it safe," said veteran miner Jake Patterson, his weathered face streaked with mineral dust. "We came out here to push boundaries, to take risks, to build something bigger than ourselves." But on Mars, where families had risked everything to start new lives on an alien world, the vote was split almost evenly. The Red Planet's residents understood better than anyone what it meant to be isolated, vulnerable, and dependent on technology they couldn't fully control. The final hour was excruciating. Vote totals crawled upward as the last remote stations reported in Antarctic research bases, deep-sea oil platforms, and isolated military outposts sent their results through encrypted channels. Every vote mattered now. The margin was razor-thin. Then, at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the final tally appeared on screens around the world. The numbers were staggering in their closeness. 3.2 billion votes for submission.
Wow.
3.7 billion for resistance. A margin of just 500 million. Votes out of nearly 7 billion cast. Humanity had chosen to fight. The announcement sent shockwaves through every corner of human civilization. In Tokyo, businessmen bowed their heads in prayer. In London, pub crowds erupted in defiant cheers. In Moscow, military commanders began dusting off contingency plans that had never been meant for alien invasion. President Harrison stood before the cameras in the White House briefing room, his face grave but determined. The weight of the decision showed in every line of his features, but his voice carried the authority of someone who'd accepted an impossible responsibility. "My fellow Americans, my fellow humans, we have made our choice. 7 billion people have spoken with one voice, and that voice has said, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not surrender our freedom without a fight. Now we must prepare for the consequences." Behind the scenes, Admiral Collins was already mobilizing every asset humanity possessed. All Space Force units to high alert. Every satellite, every orbital platform, every colonial defense grid. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. Her voice carried across communication, channels to every military installation on Earth and beyond. But the real decision, the one that would define humanity's response, came from an unexpected source. 8-year-old M.O. Price, Colonel Price's daughter, had been watching the proceedings from the family quarters at Peterson Space Force Base as her father prepared to leave for his post. She tugged on his uniform with the persistence that only children possess. "Daddy, what do you say to bullies?" Colonel Price knelt down, meeting his daughter's bright eyes. In them, he saw the future that they were all fighting for, a future where children could ask innocent questions, without fear of alien overlords. "What do you say, sweetheart?" "No," Emma said firmly, her young voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children possess. "You say no, and you mean it." Price smiled, kissed his daughter's forehead, and walked to the communication station. I know what our response should be." And with that simple exchange between father and daughter, humanity found its voice. Sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most innocent sources. Sometimes a child's wisdom cuts through adult complexity. Like a laser through smoke, the stage was set for the most important conversation in human history. But would one word be enough to change the fate of an entire species? And speaking of small actions creating massive results, if you want to see how simple, consistent choices can compound into extraordinary outcomes, check out my next video about the power of compounding. Click the link now. You'll be amazed at what you discover. The clock on the Pentagon's main display showed exactly 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 45 seconds. When Admiral Collins gave the final order, 15 seconds. 15 seconds until humanity's answer would echo across the galaxy. Around the world, communication technicians sat with their hands poised over transmission buttons, waiting for the moment that would define their species. Future, at precisely 24 hours after Commander Vex's ultimatum, every human communication array activated simultaneously. The massive radio dishes in Arecibo, their metal surfaces gleaming in the Caribbean sun. The quantum transmitters on Mars, their crystalline structures humming with exotic energy. The deep space communication satellites orbiting Earth, their antennas pointing toward the alien fleet like accusing fingers from every corner of human civilization. From the Arctic research stations to the mining platforms in the asteroid belt, the same message pulsed outward into the void. Not a speech, not a negotiation, not a plea for mercy. It's just one word, broadcast with the combined power of humanity's entire communication network. No, the word traveled at the speed of light, carrying with it the collective will of 7 billion human beings. It was the most powerful single syllable ever transmitted into space, a declaration of defiance that would be heard on worlds humanity had never dreamed of. The response was immediate and terrifying. Vex's hologram didn't just appear in the Pentagon this time. It materialized simultaneously in Times Square, Trafalgar Square, Red Square, and every major city on Earth. The alien's metallic features were twisted with something that could only be described as rage of fury, so intense it seemed to distort the air around his projection. "You have chosen extinction," Vex snarled, his voice carrying across every screen. Every speaker, every communication device on the planet. The words hit like hammer blows, each one dripping with the promise of annihilation. "Your defiance will be recorded as evidence of your species' fundamental stupidity." But President Harrison didn't flinch. He stepped forward, flanked by Admiral Collins and General Thompson. Three figures representing the best of human courage in the face of impossible odds. Were comfortable with that assessment. The simple response seemed to infuriate Vex even more. His forearms gestured wildly, his glowing eyes blazing with indignation. "You face the combined might of 1,000 conquered worlds. Our weapons can shatter moons. Your pathetic resistance is meaningless." And that's when Admiral Collins delivered the line that would become legend. She looked directly at the alien commander, her voice cold as the vacuum of space, and asked, "Then why are you still talking?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, because she was right. If the Galactic Dominion was truly all-powerful, if they could really destroy planets with casual ease, why were they wasting time with threats and ultimatums? Why not just demonstrate their power and be done with it? For the first time since his appearance, Vex hesitated. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds, everyone watching realized something crucial. The great Commander Vex was stalling. "The Dominion prefers efficient conquest," he finally said, his voice lacking the earlier confidence. "Destruction wastes resources." But the damage was done. That moment of hesitation had revealed more than any intelligence report could have. Dr. Mitchell, monitoring from the Pentagon, suddenly understood what they were really dealing with. His voice cut through the tension, like a scalpel through tissue. "You're not conquerors, you're parasites. You need us alive to feed off our productivity." The accusation hit home. Vex's metallic features contorted with fury. But there was something else there, to something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. Because Dr. Mitchell had exposed the truth that the Galactic Dominion had spent centuries hiding. They weren't the galaxy's noble rulers? They were its greatest predators, moving from world to world like locusts, consuming civilizations and leaving empty husks behind. But unlike locusts, they needed their victims alive and productive. Dead worlds don't pay tribute. Extinct species don't mine asteroids or build monuments to alien glory. Submit now, or face annihilation. Vex roared, his forearms clenched into fists. But even as he made the threat, his voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. President Harrison smiled in the face of that alien fury. Actually, there's a third option. You've just helped us find it. The statement sent ripples of confusion through the crisis room. What third option? What had they discovered that could possibly change the equation? But Harrison's military advisors were already seeing it. The pattern was becoming clear. The Galactic Dominion's entire strategy depended on intimidation and overwhelming force displays. They showed up, made threats, and counted on their victims' fear to secure compliance. It was efficient, cost-effective, and had worked on 743 previous worlds. But it only worked if the victims believed the threats were real. You've conquered 743 worlds, Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. But how many of them actually fought back? How many of them called your bluff? Vex's glowing eyes narrowed. Bluff? You think this is a bluff? I think you're a businessman, Harrison replied calmly. And destroying your inventory is bad for business. You need us alive, productive, and compliant. Which means you can't actually afford to wipe us out, can you? The alien silence was deafening. Around the world, people watching the exchange began to understand. The Galactic Dominion wasn't a military force, it was a protection racket. They showed up with overwhelming force, made threats, and collected tribute. But actually following through on those threats would destroy the very thing they were trying to steal. Your space-age loan sharks, Admiral Collins added, her voice dripping with contempt. You show up, flash your weapons, and expect people to pay up out of fear. You've never actually had to fight a war, have you? The question struck home. Because the truth was becoming obvious, the Galactic Dominion had grown soft from centuries of easy victories. They'd become so accustomed to species surrendering at the first sign of superior technology that they'd forgotten how to actually fight. This conversation is over, Vex snarled. You have 1 hour to reconsider. After that, you will learn the price of defiance. The hologram vanished, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and the growing realization that humanity had just called the galaxy's biggest bluff. But was it really a bluff, or had they just signed their species' death warrant? Admiral Collins said quietly. If we're wrong about this, ... What? Then we die free, President Harrison replied. But if we're right, then we've just discovered something that might change everything. The next hour would determine which future awaited humanity. And speaking of how single moments can change everything, if you want to understand how small, consistent actions can build into unstoppable momentum. Just like humanity's defiance was about to do, check out my video on the power of compounding. Because sometimes the smallest decisions create the biggest transformations. What the Galactic Dominion hadn't expected was humanity's most dangerous trait: our ability to turn rage into innovation. When humans get angry, really angry, we don't just fight harder, we fight smarter. And right now, 7 billion humans were absolutely furious. Within hours of Vex's second ultimatum, something extraordinary happened across human civilization. Every settlement, from the gleaming towers of Luna City to the ice-covered research stations on Titan, transformed into weapons factories. Construction workers became munitions experts. Scientists became military engineers. Children drew pictures of humans defeating aliens while their parents welded armor plating onto mining ships. The breakthrough came from Dr. Lisa, Parker's team at MIT. She'd been working around the clock, fueled by coffee and pure determination. When she stumbled across something that would change everything, her voice cracked with exhaustion and excitement as she burst into the Pentagon's command center. Their ships use a quantum field generator for propulsion, she announced breathlessly, her hair wild from 3 days without sleep. But the same frequency that powers their engines can be disrupted by our deep space communication arrays. General? Thompson looked up from the tactical displays, hope flickering in his weathered eyes. You mean we can ground them? Better than that, Parker said, her grin widening. We can turn their own power systems against them. It's like using a car's electrical system to blow up its engine. The plan that emerged was insane, desperate, and absolutely brilliant. It required every human in space to act in perfect coordinations. That would have been impossible just a week earlier. But fear and fury had united humanity in ways that diplomacy never could. Mining ships that had spent decades quietly extracting asteroids suddenly became missile platforms. Their cargo holds, designed for hauling or were packed with improvised warheads. The Mars colonies, with their massive terraforming equipment, jury-rigged their atmospheric processors into electromagnetic pulse generators powerful enough to cook alien electronics from orbit. Research stations became command centers. The orbital platforms around Earth, built for peaceful scientific observation, bristled with hastily mounted weapons. Avon, the luxury space hotels, contributed. Their fusion reactors were converted into power sources for the largest weapons humanity had ever built. The transformation was staggering. In 72 hours, humanity had gone from a peaceful, spacefaring civilization to a military force unlike anything the galaxy had seen. And the beautiful part, the aliens had given them the blueprint. By parking their ships close enough to study, when Vex's ships finally moved to attack, they found humanity ready. The first Dominion vessel to enter Earth's atmosphere was met by something. Unprecedented coordinated resistance from an entire species. The massive ship, designed to intimidate primitive civilizations, shuddered as EMP bursts from a dozen different sources overloaded its quantum field generators. Sparks cascaded along its hull as systems failed in cascading failures. The vessel that had crossed interstellar space with casual ease suddenly found itself falling toward the Pacific Ocean like a billion-ton brick. All stations, fire at will, Admiral Collins commanded, her voice carrying across every communication. Channel in the solar system. What followed was the most one-sided battle in human history. The Dominion ships, crippled by their own compromised systems, became sitting targets for every weapon humanity could muster. Railgun slugs from lunar installations, moving at significant fractions of light speed, punched through alien hulls like needles through paper. Plasma torpedoes from Mars traced brilliant arcs across the void. Nuclear-tipped missiles from Earth's orbital platforms detonated in flowers of destruction that lit up the solar system. The aliens had expected primitive resistance spears against their energy shields, chemical rockets against their advanced point defense systems. Instead, they found themselves facing weapons that exploited the very physics that powered their own technology. One by one, the alien vessels were destroyed or disabled. Ships that had conquered worlds found themselves helpless against human ingenuity and fury. The Galactic Dominion's perfect record of intimidation and conquest was being shattered by a species they had considered barely evolved apes. But the real moment of triumph came when Vex's flagship, damaged and limping, attempted to flee the battle. Colonel Price, coordinating the final assault from the Space Force Command Center, watched the alien commander's escape pod separate from the dying ship. The same alien who had threatened extinction was now running for his life. Vex's final transmission came crackling through the communication arrays, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. This is impossible. No species resists the Dominion. No species defeats us. Colonel Price smiled, thinking of his daughter Emma and her simple wisdom about bullies. He keyed his microphone and delivered the line that would echo across the galaxy. Well, Commander, you just met your first Americans. The battle was over in less than 6 hours. 12 massive alien warships, the pride of the Galactic Dominion, had been reduced to wreckage drifting through the solar system. Not a single human settlement had been lost. The species that had conquered 743 worlds had been defeated by the 744th. 3 days later, President Harrison addressed the nation and the galaxy from the Oval Office. Behind him, through the window, the wreckage of alien warships streaked. Across the sky like falling stars, burning up in Earth's atmosphere in brilliant displays of light. To any species listening across the galaxy, he said, his voice carrying the weight of humanity's newfound strength, let this be a lesson. Earth is not for conquest. Humanity is not for sale. And when bullies come calling, we have one word. For them, no. The message was broadcast on every frequency humanity possessed, transmitted to every corner of the galaxy. It was a declaration of independence, a warning to would-be conquerors, and a promise to any species still suffering under the Dominion's rule. The first shot in humanity's galactic war had been fired. But more importantly, humanity had learned something vital about the universe. Sometimes the most powerful word in any language is the simplest one. Sometimes standing up to bullies, no matter how big they are, is the only way to discover they're not as powerful as they pretend to be, and sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest acts of defiance. Speaking of how small actions can create massive results, if you want to understand how this principle can transform your own life, check out my video about the power of compounding. Because just like humanity's single word changed the galaxy, your daily choices are compounding into something extraordinary. The end.